Good evening and welcome to week 7 of 10 questions, if not now, when? In this, our 4th iteration of this course and public event series, we have deliberately positioned a call to action, if not now, when? We're asking these 10 questions because we believe that this moment, this fall, calls for a renewed commitment to one another. Climate change, a viral pandemic, polarized US politics, and lack of access to equal justice make this a precipitous time, a poignant time, and a time for all of us to consider the ways in which we can contribute to a better future for ourselves, our families, our communities, our nation, and our world, because if not now, when? Around us, there is momentum for change. I'm Vic Marks, and I'm grateful to be here with you for this conversation. Over the past couple of weeks, I've been visiting our students and our excellent graduate teachers in their discussion sections. I'm deeply heartened by the conversations you, our students, are having and the projects that you're making. As folks here may know, each week our students collaboratively create something out of nothing in response to the week's question. An essential aspect of this is to put something new into the world and to see how it changes oneself and the people around us. This evening's question is, how do we change? I'd like to set us up by offering this thought. Everything changes all the time. Nothing is static. Some changes, however, are not always perceptible within our daily lives and our mortal sense of time. Rocks, mountains, trees, forests, cities, buildings, roads, tables, chairs, these things, though referred to as nouns as if they were fixed objects, the rock, the mountain, are in fact events. Rocks and mountains, trees and forests, cities are in a constant state of transformation, but this transformation often lies outside our immediate powers of perception. So you might say, since everything is changing, the very notion of matter, of thingness, is not stillness, but action. Everything is a verb. Rocks are rocking, trees are treeing, we are living, the world is worlding all the time. Speculative fiction writer Octavia Butler, author of the book Parable of the Sower, wrote a story about our near future, a time of Earth's devastation, and a young Black woman who founds a religion called Earthseed. A central tenet of that religion is the following: all that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. What I take from this is that we are agents of change as much as we are ourselves changing all the time. So the question arises, when are we acting consciously to affect change? And when are we acting unconsciously, participating in change without recognizing the consequences? For what are we accountable? I'd like to ask everyone here, everyone, to simply write the words, "I am here," in the chat. Or share whatever formulation of that thought that works for you. I'm present. This is me. I am with you, or here I am. Please give this request your consideration, even if you're not typically a joiner in the chat. Let the fact of our being together be felt, even if we cannot see one another. Please continue to join us in adding your presence to the chat. Even in bold letters, I am here. Thank you for doing that. We are here together. And individually, we are each in the midst of change. We experience change personally, but these shifts and transformations are often deeply informed by the systems and structures, government, law, health, education, that do or don't support us, that impact us, and that I'd like to think we have the capacity to change. Next request. While your fingers are near the keyboard, let me ask you this. What is one way that you are involved in larger processes of change? Share something about the way you are changing or working for change with others. It could be singing with people in your community. It could be, I will look and see what it could be. Conversations with individuals, collaborating in your class, tutoring children who need help, volunteering, avoiding plastics. I'm doing that too. Fighting for the equality of women, climate change and pollutions by trying to be more conscious about plastic and reusable things. Eating a plant-based diet, communicating. Thank you, thank you. Please continue to share the ways in which you are participating with others in change. This fall, we began with the question, who are we? And continued forward with, how do we begin? How do we connect? How do we remember? How do we heal? And last week, how do we fail? In joining together here and asking these questions, we are changing, sometimes minutely, sometimes immeasurably, together. We're changed by our presence here. We are changed by reading what one another has left in the chat. We are living examples of Octavia Butler's claim, all that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you. Going back to our first question, who are we? Being enveloped in processes of change is one of the things that makes us a we. This evening, we'll hear from 3 guests, urban environmental planning professor and interdisciplinarian, Dr. V. Kelly Turner, social justice scholar and advocate, Dr. D'Artagnan Scorza, and hip hop artivist, Jackie Lopez, AKA Miss Funk. Each of these extraordinary guests focus on the possibilities and necessities of conscious change, and in some measure, the consequences of ignoring the call for change. This will be followed by a video from our partner, the Visual and Performing Arts and Education Program, who worked with the Tap Chicks at the Pasadena Senior Center. Then our panelists will have a discussion. Then we will take questions from you, our audience. So let's get to it. Dr. V. Kelly Turner is an assistant professor of urban planning with an appointment in geography and affiliation with the Institute for Environment and Sustainability at UCLA. She also co-directs the Luskin Center for Innovation and Environmental Policy and Planning Center in the Luskin School of Public Affairs. Dr. Turner studies ways to make urban environments more environmentally sustainable with a focus on extreme heat, residential yards, and storm water management. Her work is funded by the National Science Foundation, the Strategic Growth Council of California, and published in journals such as Nature Communications, Environmental Research Letters, in the Journal of the American Planning Association. Welcome, Kelly.
Thank you so much, Victoria. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited about this opportunity. One of the most interdisciplinary opportunities I've had since coming to UCLA. And also, I thank you for speaking about Parable of the Sower. It's such a powerful book. I saw one of the last things I did before we started social distancing was seeing the performance at UCLA, and then decided to listen to the audiobook during my COVID walks, which was a real trip to listen to her words during a pandemic. So I'm gonna share my screen here. So today we're talking about change, and I'm really excited to talk about change kind of from a little bit from the perspective of the arts, even though I myself am not an artist. Back in graduate school, I had the opportunity to take a class, a workshop in which we were collaborating, scientists and artists together, on something having to do with climate change. And it took almost the whole year for us to realize that it was just a really one-way thing, where the art was supposed to be in service of the science, and we realized what a challenge it was to make the science in service of the art, right? To kind of flip the narrative. And Zoom, several years later, I'm here in Los Angeles. I've got a good friend who's an art historian. I'm studying heat, and there's this stuff called cool pavement or cool materials, solar reflective materials. And we decided to do a project, and you're looking at it here. It's called Blue Zeus, and it's by a wonderful artist called Eric Skotnes. And this was a labor of love, almost all donated materials. This is in South LA. And it was done all with multiple colors of solar reflective paint. And this is a thermal image. So this painting exists both in the visual spectrum and the thermal spectrum. And what I love about this, it's a first attempt, it's a proof of concept. But what I love about this is that there's an opportunity on the art end for expression using the technologies. And there's also an opportunity for sort of awareness and communication about science. So it really sort of does that sort of two-way street with art and science. I wanted to share a quote that I came across several years ago, and it really, I think, summarizes how I think about change. And this is a scholar, a geographer named Paul Robbins, and he was writing a review of this very scientific document about where should the field of geography go in the next 20 years, 30 years. And he writes a little bit of a critique, but he has this nugget in here, and it's such a gem. So I'll read the whole thing for you. It says, the volume is at its best, as is the discipline, when it presents readers in the public with counterintuitive findings that turn problems on their heads, compel new avenues for thinking, and stress the emergent dialectical or downright strange lessons of geography. And I love this because that's really, I think, the heart of change, is just changing, not just changing something that must change, but changing the very logic with which we use to look at conventional ways of knowing. So I'm going to share with you a couple surprising, I think, findings spanning lots of different projects that I've worked on. And the first one that's shaken things up here has to do with cool pavement. So the city of Los Angeles is pioneering this new surface coating that can be put onto streets, and it cools the surfaces. And why would you want to do that? Well, there's something called the urban heat island. Cities are hotter than undeveloped regions because we put a lot of built stuff, asphalt, pavement, buildings, cars, people, and we all contribute to making cities hotter. And so this cool pavement is supposed to cool down the city, as the namesake goes. And so this is a pair of headlines. On the left side, the LA Times is saying that cool pavement makes streets 10 to 15 degrees. Sorry, that should say cooler. Change it. 10 to 15 degrees cooler than asphalt. And then on the other side, it should say cool pavement is 7 degrees hotter than asphalt. Well, which one is true? Can cool pavement really make the streets cooler and hotter at the same time? The answer is yes. But the problem is we're not being very nuanced in how we talk about heat. So on the left side, they're talking about the surface temperature, and on the right side, they're talking about something called mean radiant temperature. So how does that work? On the far left side, A panel, you see asphalt. The sunlight is coming slowly down, hitting the asphalt. What happens is the asphalt absorbs all that solar energy and it gets hot and it traps it, and it slowly re-radiates that heat from the surface throughout the day, making it feel really hot, especially in the late afternoon to early evening hours. In the middle, panel B, we have cool pavement. And what happens is incoming sunlight comes in, hits the cool pavement, and the cool pavement doesn't absorb that sunlight the same way asphalt does. Instead, it re-radiates it. It reflects it really fast. And so if you know heat cannot be created or destroyed, energy cannot be created or destroyed, right? It goes somewhere. And so what's happening is cool pavement keeps the pavement cool, but in the short term, it makes things really hot for people who are standing above it. And then on the right side panel, you see shade. And shade is a little bit different because what shade does is it prevents that solar energy from coming in the first place. So you don't have the problem of re-radiation. You get cooler exposure. People are cooler because they're not exposed to sunlight, and asphalt and cool pavement, you don't have to worry so much about the re-radiation. Right. So that's one sort of anecdote. And this is problematic because we make policies that start to get entrenched around a really general idea about heat and what solves heat. And then when we get into the nuance and the nitty gritty, it's actually kind of more complicated. And I'll leave it at saying that I never thought that cool pavement would be the most political thing I studied, but it has been the most political thing I've studied. Okay, and what is this? This has to do with heat framings. And this could be true for like anything you study, but I study heat. So one thing that happens is that we get these different narratives around heat. So on the far right, this is the one we probably hear the most, and this really took off this summer, is that extreme heat. Heat kills more people than all other weather-related disasters combined. Extreme heat is going to be exacerbated because of climate change. And this is one narrative about heat. A second narrative is this urban heat island, that heat's going to be worse in cities because we have all this built stuff that makes it hotter, right? And the thing is, these direct our attention to different solution sets, right? So if we're worried about extreme heat, these are anomalous events, heat waves. We can't control heat waves. They happen because of weather patterns. And so we focus on things like dealing with the heat, coping with the heat, making people safe during these events. If we're focused on urban heat, that's something we totally can control by designing cities differently. And then we start to focus on solutions like cool pavement or vegetating and planting trees, that kind of thing. There's another framing out there, and this is heat equity. However, this is sort of lesser. So we've studied hundreds and hundreds of city plans from across the United States, and we found that only about 25% of them use an equity narrative. And this is problematic because we also know that heat is one of the most inequitable consequences of climate change, one of the most inequitable things, environmental conditions in cities. If you live in a city that was historically redlined, you are more likely to be exposed to extreme heat conditions. So we have these different framings, and they they set the direction of the solutions that we follow. So if we care about extreme heat, then we're thinking about trees as adaptation. We think about trees as something we do to cope with how hot it is. And if we care about urban heat island, then it's mitigation. We're mitigating something, and we're holding developers and people who plan cities on the line and holding them accountable for the things they do that make our cities hotter. If we care about extreme heat, then we're talking about acute events, shock events. If we care about urban heat, then we're caring about chronic heats, right? And sometimes the worlds collide, sometimes they don't. But the question is, does it matter? And I think it does, because we find in our review of city plans that the different solutions aggregate out. If you have a plan that uses an extreme heat framing, you're more likely to get something like warning, caution, education as the response. If you have an urban heat island framing in an urban plan, then you're more likely to get interventions that focus on things like trees. So changing the problem framing can also unlock new legal doors. So this is an op-ed that I wrote, and it was meant to be somewhat provocative. And this comes from being an interdisciplinarian and studying things like stormwater management. And we have this really mature set of institutions around stormwater runoff. The Environmental Protection Agency tells developers what they can and cannot do in order to be in compliance with stormwater runoff and flooding. And we have agencies to monitor water quality, but we don't have anything like that. There's no government entity to regulate heat. What if we framed heat as pollution? What if we said we were creating a thermal burden in communities when we developed using surfaces that are known to be hot? That would unlock things like the EPA to come regulate. Now, the EPA is not perfect. We know that there are holes in its regulatory capacity, but it unlocks a new way of thinking about dealing with heat. What if we said people have a right to be thermally comfortable? That unlocks new legal doors for which we can start to think about heat and solving the problem. So I will leave it at that. I'll thank you. And I'm showing my stripes on the left side. To the right side, it shows years, 1985 to 2020, and the mean deviation in temperature in California. And it's showing red is hot, so we are getting hotter. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Kelly. So I think right off, while we're talking about heat, you're really inviting us to think about the ways in which we can use unconventional logics or resilient perceptual techniques to change the problem in order to create the kind of changes that we are looking for. Is that right?
Yes.
I think that the thought of creating heat, talking about heat as pollution and talking about it as a civil right is thrilling. I'm glad you're writing those op-eds, and just as recently as June 2021, that was.
Yeah. Yeah, we currently have a project in collaboration with legal scholars to actually play that out, right? What would it look like?
So now you're following through on that particular attack. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Oh, very exciting. Yeah. Very exciting. Well, let's continue forward, and we'll come back to a discussion with Kelly. Thank you, Kelly. I'd now like to introduce Dr. D'Artagnan Scorza, who believes that education can be used as a tool for civic and social empowerment in order to advance justice in communities. Currently serving as inaugural executive director of racial equity for LA County, his work centers on building leaders who fight for equity in communities and schools. He founded and was the executive director of the Social Justice Learning Institute and served on the Inglewood Unified School District as president of the Board of Education. Dr. Scorza is a lecturer in the Fielding School of Public Health, a UC Regent Emeritus, and current president of the UCLA Alumni Association. As a US Navy Iraq War veteran, Dr. Scorza believes that being a responsible leader means setting a strong personal example. Among his many accolades for his work, paving, and no puns intended there, paving the way in advocacy, policy, and philanthropy, he was recognized as one of the 40 emerging civic leaders under 40 in 2018. No guessing his age. Welcome, D'Artagnan.
Thank you so much, Vic, for having me. I want to thank you all so much for allowing me to be here. As you heard a bit about my background, I'm D'Artagnan Scorza. I'm going to do a little bit of sort of visual representation today. I am a young male, African-American. I am wearing a blue sweater with a beard, and we'll be sharing some screen, be sharing a presentation today. So that, and I'll do my best to actually describe what's in that presentation for our friends who may not be, who may be visually impaired. I want to acknowledge that I am and represent my family, right? I am from Los Angeles. I was born and raised here, and I've had the pleasure of descending from some incredible folk who are from both Louisiana, but also from Arkansas and other states. And so I think knowing a bit about my background hopefully will help explain sort of why and how, you know, I'm talking about change. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen and articulate sort of what it means, at least from my point of view, what it means to bring about change, and to talk about how that works. As you are all aware, in 2020, we experienced a tremendous we had a number of tremendous experiences between both the pandemic as well as the challenges that emerged from the death of George Floyd. Our society has been upended in many ways, forcing us to reckon with the role of race and racism in our history and in our past. I was proud to have been asked to serve as the inaugural executive director for racial equity in LA County. And when I'm thinking about change, I'm thinking about what it's going to take to help us move towards a world where we're achieving racial equity. I'm also thinking about what it's going to take for us to fundamentally transform and alter how we see that world. And so I start by sort of offering a brief definition of what racial equity is. It's ultimately to envision a genuinely non-racist society where no one receives more benefits or burdens simply because of the color of their skin. It doesn't mean that we ignore the role that race or ethnicity or racism plays in our experiences, but it means that we ultimately get to the place where we're not experiencing disparities because you grew up in a certain neighborhood or you come from a certain background, or you are facing additional levels of hate and violence directed towards your community simply because of where you were born. And so in the work that I do, we focus on and center anti-racism. And anti-racism is really about helping to eliminate structural racism by rethinking our systems, rethinking the structures and the policies that led us to the place that we are at today, and redistributing power and resources so that they're shared equitably. And when we talk about equity, that means ultimately paying attention to the circumstances that people experience. It's about not just treating everyone the same, right? Which is ultimately equality, giving everyone the same thing, treating them the same, sort of irrespective of their background and circumstances. When I talk about equity, I mean that we actually account for those backgrounds, we account for their circumstances, and we treat people justly on the basis of them. In other words, we invest in communities where folk have been historically and disproportionately divested from. We ensure that we move our resources towards folk who are more likely to need them as well. And so it's really about us thinking strategically about how we transform. Now, I know this seems like a really complicated figure here, but what I'm describing right now is sort of a core and a ring of things that go into what shapes our worldview, be it our perspectives on gender or religion or social class or culture or sexual orientation. This core and this ring and these components of our identity are informed by the context that we experience growing up. for example, the family we grew up in, or the neighborhoods we grew up in, or the schools we grow up in or go to, all affect how we see ourselves. They affect the values that we hold. It affects the worldview that we utilize to perceive the world around us. And these components of our identity, either the spiritual components, our religious identity, our sexual orientation, our gender identity, all shape how we come to see and understand the world. So when you ask me this question about how we change, it starts by really understanding, like, who are we? Who do we show up as? What informs how we've come to see the world? What shapes the way in which we make sense of the world? How do we think about our meaning-making filter, i.e. the perceptions and the interpretations of the experiences we have in the world around us, to create our understandings about race or society or one's socioeconomic status, or how we perceive people around us. That also helps us understand sort of how we create either places where people can belong to our communities, or places where we create a sense of otherness around them on the basis of either one's ability or their gender or their age or their class or their skin tone or their sexuality. We change by becoming aware of and understanding the perspectives that we have about others in the world, but also by examining how those perspectives show up for us through our biases, as well as through the experiences we continue to face in society. More specifically, it helps us to understand how we can locate ourselves within the historical context that we all live in today. What got us to where we are? What got us to the place where climate change, for example, is a problem, right? How did the Industrial Revolution lead to affecting our conditions today? How did the role of racism affect the health outcomes that people experience today? How did policies like the Federal Housing Administration's effort to create redlining, right, which determined which communities received investment from the financial sector, as well as which communities were required to maintain segregated housing, right? How did that affect how we see the world? And how does that show up in the way in which we view others today? And in fact, the ways in which we blame others for their circumstances, or the ways in which we sort of avoid the commonalities that we hold on to, or even deny the common and shared humanity that we may have. Understanding this helps us rethink and reframe the way in which we see the world. So when you ask me how we change, especially when it comes to living in a post sort of George Floyd era, right, where we're trying to reconcile and reckon with the challenges that this country and this nation has faced for so long, it starts not only with our sense of self-awareness, meaning our ability to reflect upon our own identities, racial and otherwise, but it also requires that we understand the impacts of systems and institutions that affect our identities. When we do that, we are better equipped to challenge our own beliefs and biases, to challenge the worldview that we bring with us in all of the circumstances that we experience. And we can examine the ways in which those perspectives, those perceptions, that worldview shows up both in how we express ourselves, but also in how we treat others. We can also build greater capacity, both in our lives, but also in the lives of the people around us, by learning about the role that race and racism plays, the role that inequity and inequality plays in our society, and embrace this idea that we're all on a journey to growth, right? And being on that journey to growth, we're never going to get it right? We're sort of becoming better each and every day, but we're committing to this idea of being better by rejecting sort of deficit thinking, this idea that we blame people for their circumstances. I take on one of my heroes, Bell Hooks, who's a Black feminist educator and theorist who really talks about the role of hope and love, right? She says, I do the work I do because I have hope and because I love people, right? We start from this place where it's hard to blame people for their circumstances when you are operating from a place of love. And then finally, we can take action by changing the way we talk about people, the way we talk about ourselves, the way we talk about others. Be aware of our own self-talk and the way in which we express that self-talk. And more specifically, by showing up for people who are affected and impacted by the conditions, by the material conditions that we experience. I think the pandemic has really laid bare what so many of us that grew up in communities of concentrated disadvantage knew. The pandemic has exposed the digital divide. It exposed the lack of healthcare access. It exposed the lack of educational opportunities for so many communities. And by taking an approach that partners with people who are experiencing these conditions, people with lived experience, we're able to then focus on improving the conditions and lives, not just of folk who are living in communities of concentrated disadvantage, but the lives of our own, right? We're able to better improve outcomes and close disparities. So with that being said, I'll pause there, and I very much look forward to continuing our conversation.
There we go. Had trouble unmuting myself. Thank you so much, D'Artagnan, and really appreciate thinking about the work, the anti-racism work that we all have to do. And I think one thing I just wanted to sort of draw up or lean into right now is you're talking about hope and love, which in academic settings, we don't, I feel as though we've shied away from, let's talk about love. And I just wonder if you have a thought about that, like, should we reassert love back into the university? How does it work?
You know, that's a great question. Thank you, Victoria. I will say that we often shy away from talking about hope and love because, you know, we all have sort of different ways we approach and think about it. And it's hard to sort of pin down what that means in so many ways, right? It seems in some cases amorphous. So it's like, what does that mean to love, you know, people in the context of this environment? But I will say it's interesting because I remember when I had one of my faculty advisors years ago, he asked me this question. He said, what does it mean to love your work? And if your work is working with youth, working with students to help improve their outcomes, what does that actually mean, right? What does it mean to, you know, to love what you're doing, but not just what you're doing, it's the people you're doing it with, right? Like it sort of became sort of a guiding value for me to understand, you know, how do we need to show up in ways that lift others up so that they can be their best selves? That it's not about, you know, saving people. It's not about, you know, trying to do things to be charitable. It's really about helping people recognize their power and helping them understand how they can translate that power into change for their own lives. So for me, when I talk about love, to me, that means that I'm working with people so that they can move towards self-determination. They can move towards self-efficacy and do for themselves in ways that, you know, don't rely upon these broader systems, these broader institutions, right? That I render myself useless to the point that they're able to do and to be empowered to transform their own conditions. And so when I'm thinking about love, that's what I'm thinking about. What will it take for me to use my resources, my, you know, knowledge and my skill sets to help ensure that others can do for themselves as well? And yes, I think we need to bring that back into a conversation within the university.
Yeah, and let's come back to that in a little while. But for now, I'd like to make a shift. I'd like to introduce Miss Funk. Jackie Miss Funk Lopez is a first-generation Latina Los Angeles native. She was the first in her family to graduate high school and college, and often attributes this success to the profound impact that the arts and dance have made in her life. Jackie graduated summa cum laude with UCLA's Department of World Arts and Cultures, and for the last 22 years has been working as a professional dancer, choreographer, teaching artist, and cultural educator with students and artists of all ages, nationally and internationally. Jackie is the co-founder, co-artistic director of Versus Style Dance Company, a professional hip-hop touring company that supports dancers from the inner city to thrive, while also providing hip-hop arts programming to youth in underserved LA communities. Through her work, Jackie has created a pipeline in which many first-gen students have benefited both artistically and academically. And as lecturer in my own Department of World Arts and Culture Dance, I'm proud to call her a colleague and a friend. Welcome, Jackie.
Thank you so much, Vic. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I've been very moved. I think the order of how this is going is on point because everything that my boy just talked about just now really touched me in deep ways as the work and how we show up with love. I feel every time I teach from a place of love. And I think that's been part of the huge success in my career and how I'm passing down this lineage of hip hop artistry and specifically from the Black and Brown communities. But I'm just gonna get right to it. I wanted to perform for everyone, be an artist at the core. I'm an administrator, I teach, I facilitate, but I will always first and foremost be an artist and performer. And I just want to do a little bit of speaking, talking in the beginning, along with a performance at the end. So just be with me, everybody. Okay, I'm gonna start. These Zoom performances is a new thing. Talk about change, how we're constantly adapting. And that's something that artists have that ability to do. All right. Change upon change, upon change, upon change, upon change. Change in me. Change in we. Change all my life. Change all my life. I had to change. All my life, I had to fight. Change. Immigrant parents, change. Hablando el español y el inglés, change. Brown skin, change. Adapt, shift, stop, breathe. Change. Change upon change upon change upon change. Butterfly. Change. Hip hop. Change. Popping and locking. Change. Black and brown. Change. We begin the change. I am the change. Hip hop is change. Change upon change upon change upon change. Adapt, shift, stop, breathe. Change. How do you change?
Be all right. All's my life I has to fight. All's my life I hard times like yeah, bad chips like yeah. Nazareth, I'm fucked up, homie, you fucked up, but if God got when I wake up, I recognize you looking at me for the pay cut. Bahamas, I be looking at you from the face down. One Mac 11, even boom with the face down. Skimming, and let me tell you about my life. Painkillers only put me in the twilight. But pretty Benjamin is the highlight. I tell my mama I love her, but this what I like. Lord knows, 20 of them in my Chevy. Tell them all to come and get me, reaping everything I sow. So my karma come in heaven, no preliminary hearings on my record. I'm a gangster in silence for the record. Tell the world I know it's too late. Boys and girls, I think I've gone great. Trying to side my face this all day. Won't you please believe when I say, when you know we've been hurt, been down before. When our pride was low, looking at the world like, where do we go? And we hate poor, wanna kill us dead in the street for sure. I'm at the preacher's door, my knees getting weak and my gun might blow, but we gon' be alright.
We gon' be alright. We gon' be alright. We gon' be alright. Do you hear me? Do you feel me? We gon' be alright. We gon' be alright. Huh? We gon' be alright. We gon' be alright. Do you hear me? Do you feel me? We gon' be alright.
What you want? You a house, you a car, 40 acres and a mule, a piano, a guitar, anything. See, my name is Lucy, I'm your dog. You can live at the mall. I can see the evil, I can tell it. I know it's illegal. I don't think about it. I deposit every letter zero. Thinking of my partner, put the candy penning on the Rico. Digging in my pocket, in a profit, big enough to feed you every day. My logic, get another dollar just to keep you in the presence of your Chico. I don't talk about it, be about it. Every day a sequel. If I got it, then you know you got it. Heaven, I can reach you. Pet dog, my dog, that's all. Big back and chat, I trap the bag for y'all. I rap, I black on tracks, so rest assured. My rights, my wrongs, I right till I'm right for God. When you know we've been hurt, been down before. When our pride was low, looking at the world like, where do we go? And we hate poor, wanna kill us dead in the street for sure. I'm at the preacher's door, my knees getting weak and my gun might blow, but we gon' be alright.
We gon' be alright. We gon' be alright. We gon' be alright. Do you hear me? Do you feel me? We gon' be alright. We gon' be alright. Huh? We gon' be alright. We gon' be alright. Do you hear me? Do you feel me? We gon' be alright.
I keep running across my loving me is complicated. Too afraid of life changes. I'm alright in your favor. Dark nights in my prayers. I remember you was conflicted, misusing your influence. Sometimes I did the same, abusing my power full of resentment. Resentment that turned into a deep depression. Found myself screaming in the hotel room. I didn't want to self-destruct. The evils of Lucy was all around me. So I went running for answers.
How do we change?
Oh.
Done.
Thank you, Jackie. Well, lest we get complacent in our seats, no way, no way. I think we were all dancing right there with you. And, you know, I think I saw something in the chat as well, but it feels like you're talking about change on so many levels. And of course, dancing is change. You're never one place. Is that right?
Especially, definitely never in one place. And as a hip hop practitioner, street dance practitioner who carries the legacy of all of our people, it's so beyond me. So I dance from a place where I'm constantly paying homage, specifically to all the Black and brown folk that have provided the way for me to be here. So I come from this place of freestyle and that essence, because it's so pure in the moment. How do we honor that? How do we shift? How do we change? And still carry that legacy of individuality within, yet all my ancestors behind. So I was just really loving everything I was hearing, just because at the end of the day, it's all interconnected, all intertwined. And I wanted to just bring that power of that freestyle essence, because it speaks to me purely. And when I speak from that place and when I figured that out, it's when change happened versus following a blueprint that was provided for me. I was like, exit with the blueprint. Pure from a place of love. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. And that ties right back into what Professor Kelly Turner was saying. So I hope we'll come back to that. Jackie, that was fantastic. I'm going to just make a shift now. I think we should keep dancing. But before we shift and have a conversation with our guests, I'd like to bring you through the magic of the internet machine, Kevin Kane, Poof, the director of UCLA's Visual and Performing Arts Education Program, and he will introduce our special guests for tonight. Welcome, Kevin.
Thank you, Vic, and hello, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. Once again, it's my pleasure to represent VAPA and be with you all tonight, and an especially wonderful chance to follow the great Jackie Lopez, Miss Funk. We're going to follow up some dance with some more dance, actually. As we've heard throughout the evening, there are many ways to respond to the question, how do we change? Yes, the Greeks understood that change is the only constant, and that's a reality that seems clearly true and universal to this day, but it's incredibly complex nonetheless. And hopefully tonight's community arts project will add even more nuance and clarity to that question. VAPA recently has had the pleasure to work closely with a new group of community members for our program, asking them to take on this pertinent question and to understand it from a rather new perspective for our VAPA program, from elders in our community. So this week, rather than hearing from our usual participants, middle and high school students, or even multi-generational family groupings, we were ever so fortunate to talk about change with folks in our community that have lived through a lot of change in their lifetimes. The senior citizens attending VAPA's weekly art sessions at the Pasadena Senior Center. And with COVID safety guidelines lifting, and we can once again be in person with our local communities, it was a great opportunity to share actual space and time with this remarkable group. Also a chance to explore the question of the week through a different art medium. These past few weeks, if you've been with us, you've seen we've responded to the questions being posed using art forms such as music, visual arts, and crafts, and theater arts. And this week we work within the art form of dance, as we just got a taste of. Dance as a way to understand and address the challenges of change, but also the opportunity for great wisdom, growth, and new possibilities when we explore and accept the reality of change in our lives, or otherwise for some of us known as aging. It's been a great honor to explore these ideas with a dynamic group of movers known as the Tap Chicks. They're a self-formed and self-directed group of dancers of a certain age working out of the Senior Center in Pasadena. And as part of this year's creative aging focus in VAPA, a concerted effort to help UCLA arts education students understand what it means to be a lifelong learner in the arts, and as teaching artists to develop more strategies to teach the arts to people of all ages. Tonight's video is told through the perspective of a UCLA undergraduate. Miel Lei Apostle, a dance major and a VAPA minor, tracking her experience of meeting, teaching, and learning from and with this extraordinary group of women, the Tap Chicks. To my mind, this short video could certainly be developed into a full-length documentary, as the subjects in the video are so inspiring, their commitment to dancing so uplifting, and their reflection so powerful and poignant. But for now, please accept this 4.5-minute snapshot of this amazing group doing what they love to do, dance. Before I take off, thank you so much, Miel, for allowing us to see this project through your eyes. Also to VAPA coordinators, Raimundo and Tigran, thank you for your valuable contributions for shooting and editing this footage. And a huge shout out of gratitude to all the coordinators of the Pasadena Senior Center and the Tap Chicks, some of whom are with us tonight in the webinar. Hello, Tap Chicks, and thank you for your generosity, your talent and wisdom. And yes, thank you for your hope and love. Let's play the video.
One of the questions that I asked them were, what's the best part of aging? And a lot of them agreed that the older you are, the wiser you get. And for me, that resonates so much because I've always believed that when you're growing and when you're changing, it's our life experience and our adversities that keep us going and that help us change for the better.
My changes have gone in phases, you know, and because I had, you know, as a kid, I danced and I really enjoyed it. I did a lot of dancing. My mother kept me in dance school. And then I had a long period of life where I was working. And I didn't really think about dance. Just to share with you, as a young woman going out with my friends, we used to, like, just for an example, just go out, and we used to go to these clubs because we enjoyed dancing salsa. What it feels like to dance now is amazing, because at my age I don't see that many people dancing. The fact that I can move the way I can is like a blessing.
Being so old, I've changed many different ways and many different times in my life. I'm 78 now, and I have 5 kids, 23 grandkids, 9 great-grandkids. I mean, you know, and they all live fairly close to me, so I have a very large, we call it a tribe. Of course, I've gotten older, a lot older, and I've slowed down. I'm not quite as, I don't walk as fast. I used to walk really fast and, you know, do everything fast. I still do things fairly fast, but that's another story too. I took tap dancing lessons from Pam at the community center. And then when I retired, I joined the Tap Chicks, and I've been dancing ever since. And I love it because it's a lot of fun, and I give it credit for keeping me active and, you know, fairly healthy.
I noticed over the ages, over the years, my body has changed, but my mind hasn't. In my mind, I still am young and full of energy. I'm still full of energy, but for some reason, my body doesn't want to move exactly like I used to. But in my mind, I am doing it, which I don't know if it transfers physically out there. I'm sure it doesn't, because I'm much stiffer than I used to be. But I love it just as much. And I love to entertain and just move. And the movement gives me joy. And it seems to help my students too. I love to teach the dance and the movements, and people come out of their shell. And it's so inspiring to me that I can help them.
One of the best reminders and advice that they actually gave me was to really just worry less about what you look like and worry more about what you're turning into, what you're transforming into, and the person that you are becoming today. And that, you know, every day we always have decisions that we can make so that we can lead ourselves to a better and healthier and happier lifestyle.
When the whistle blows and the cymbals crash and the songs are like a sky, I'm gonna take on, I'm gonna carry on. Give me an open door to go, give me an open door. They call it everything goes, nowhere to hide when I'm getting too close. Nowhere to hide when I'm getting too close. It goes with you, baby, turn it on. All through my city, all through my home. 'Cause flying up no feeling when we in our zone.
Thank you to the Tap Chicks and the folks who organized at the Pasadena Community Center and all of VAPA. That was simply fantastic. I know we only got to see a short segment of the Tap Chicks tapping, but I find myself thinking about rhythm, that attention to the organization of time as a way of thinking about change. I mean, rhythm is a way of graphing time, because each time you hear a sound, it's saying, I'm here, and now I'm here, and here, and here, and here. So there we are. for there you are, moving through time. If you're here, Tap Chicks and all the folks associated with the VAPA video, please let us know in the chat. And now back to our special guests for tonight. First of all, again, thank you all for being here. I want to just start with a couple of questions. One is, it occurs to me, and we're seeing so much pleasure in dancing, but change can cause discomfort. Do you agree? And that discomfort can be understood as a personal challenge, or maybe an institutional challenge, or a societal challenge. Can I ask, in each of your areas of work, what about discomfort?
I guess maybe I'll go. Could you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
What about discomfort?
Yeah. If you don't, we can pause for a second and just like put up those Tap Chicks.
Yeah, right. Well, first of all, yes, props to the Tap Chicks. I want to be like them when I get older. That's what I'm talking about.
Me too.
Pretty amazing.
I want to be like them now.
Exactly. I'm gonna go dance with them. It's gonna get done here. But discomfort, I can't, if I talk from a very pure place, and I'm owning that voice and who I am, my whole entire trajectory with dance, specifically with institutions, has been always discomfort. Being a first generation Latina from immigrant parents who, you can only imagine everything I did was being translated. For them, my survival mechanism was just to work. So then to discover dance at an early age was definitely a means of survival always. And that's purely from a place of always discomfort, because survival is discomfort. I'm talking from a literal space of what we experience as a first generation family, to then being put in institutions where at the time I recall, specifically with my journey with UCLA, feeling, this brown full-figured girl wearing her shoes and all her clothing, because I would never want to get in those spandex and, rock it that way. Everything just felt very uncomfortable, almost, and I have to speak from an honest place, almost not belonging, right? So how do you break through that? How do I navigate through that? So at the same essence, in the same breath, how that journey specifically within UCLA and so on also gave me the strength and the knowledge to keep moving forward, because I was embraced, and a lot of folks held space for me when I was needed, and desperately needed at the time, because we're talking almost 18 years ago now, and a lot has changed now. So now as a lecturer, I make sure to provide that space, be one with the folks that maybe I feel some similarities with, and tell them that it's okay to feel the discomfort, because you got to go through that to hopefully get a little comfortable. So again, that was like my own personal journey, but right now we're in a time where personal stories are more powerful than ever, and during COVID, owning that space and hopefully inspiring the next full-figured woman of color of all the possibilities. That's at least from my angle.
Thank you so much, Jackie. So, but I think, and how great to start with a personal story, but I think, whenever we're in a process of change as society or communities, right, it's not an easy thing. And even education, it's uncomfortable because you're going someplace you've never been before. So I just wonder how that affects you, Kelly, or you, D'Artagnan, in your own work. Maybe it's not personal discomfort. Maybe it's like the, social, like the challenges of social change. Where is?
My silence should be read as too many thoughts, not none.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
You want to go?
I was thinking the same thing. I was thinking, I'll tell you what showed up for me. So what showed up for me was my experience in South Africa. So in 2001, being an undergraduate student here at UCLA, I traveled to South Africa and studied abroad. And I remember landing, in the country. It was one of the first times I had done such an international trip. And I just remember thinking to myself, I grew up here in South LA. I'm from, both Watson, Inglewood, and I get to South Africa and I began to experience such a great degree of discomfort. I grew up, much like my sister here, Jackie, in areas where we live with concentrated poverty and disadvantage. And so, at some point, my family, my mom was struggling to make ends meet, and we ended up being homeless and had to move around. And there's just a lot that happened when I was a child. And so when I got to South Africa and I saw how folk had been displaced from the land, how they were living in these informal townships, how, in many cases, people didn't have, shelter. And, it really sort of, talk about discomfort, it really sort of forced me to reconcile and to deal with my own privilege. So although I had grown up with challenges here in the States, in the US, I was able to see how, in many ways, like how our systems and institutions continue to create inequities, no matter the society, no matter the place. And I would say that sort of that discovery, that awakening, that experience left in me an ongoing degree of discomfort. And I say that meaning I live in discomfort every day. I live every time I experience what I see, what I consider to be sort of inequities or people suffering, when we have resources, when we have the opportunity to heal, when we have opportunities to transform conditions, I stay in that place of discomfort. I don't ever want to be comfortable, if that makes sense. I want to live a good life. I want to be in peace, but I don't ever want to be comfortable with the way things are. And I think for me, that sense of discomfort is what also drives my desire to create change, right? Not being able to accept and not being okay with the experiences that people face in their communities when they're, more likely to die as a result of, their exposure to COVID, because they don't have comorbidity issues, or they don't have, decent health care in their neighborhoods. Like, I don't ever want to be okay with that, right? And I don't ever want to be okay with the inequities that we experience. So to me, like, I think we have to be okay with sitting in and living in that discomfort and allowing ourselves to live a full life, but also recognizing there's we have to show up in ways that are help make things better for ourselves and for others.
So I think you're getting a heart, but I also think you're talking about that somehow empathy drives the need for change. And that probably will circle us right back to love. But before we go there, and maybe we can bookmark that, Kelly, I want to hear any of the thoughts that you would like to share.
Yeah. I grew up depending on, I feel like your experience, your personal experience is so relative. Like, we as individuals occupy so many spaces. Your story of going to South Africa. I also visited South Africa, and it was a very uncomfortable experience, but a very moving one at the same time. I grew up with quite a bit of privilege. I was a middle-class child of a professor and a nurse. I went to an elite private school where I was called white trash. So, it all goes to show where your positionality is, it's constantly changing. But I don't think I let my personal I always kept an arm's length. I mean, I was taught to be a good scientist and not let the personal affect the passion that you feel intellectually. That changed for me, and it has changed.
Kelly, I think you're breaking up.
I came out. Sorry. I was saying, can you hear me now?
Yes.
It's my internet.
Yeah,
can-
that is not behaving.
Okay, well,
We've got you now.
oh, okay, but I said, you know, when I came to UCLA 3 years ago, I got divorced from a really toxic and dangerous marriage. I became a single mother. I switched disciplines and I came out as a queer woman. And all of those things made me just kind of say, like, to hell with it. I'm going to advocate and I'm going to care. And I feel really passionate about heat as something that is a tool. I have scientific tools that I can bring to communities, and you know, I'm not going to be complacent any longer and sort of just not advocate for things that I know to be true for science, because I believe that really good science in the right hands can change the world.
Oh, that sounds like a love story as well. Right?
Love all around.
Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting how these really important things that we do in our communities and, you know, around ourselves, you know, in terms of sustainability, in terms of anti-racism, in terms of building culture, you know, also are tied to very deep places within us, our, you know, personal. And I just want to recognize that we come together here in the academy, but you're speaking, each of you are speaking so deeply and personally. And I want to thank you for bringing all the dimensions of yourselves into the virtual room. Perhaps you have questions for one another. I don't want to step in the way, but I also have plenty of questions for you all. I'll give you a moment. Well, okay, I'll just tell you one of my other questions. I'm so fascinated with Kelly's thesis that sometimes when we're going to try to solve a problem, and let's just assume that change and problem solving are intrinsically connected, that it's a question of how we look at the problem itself. It's sort of about, it sounded to me, Kelly, like resilient thinking and perspective shifting, a kind of moving outside of the logics of perception to ask a different question that may take us to a place of change. Like, for example, you're reconsidering heat as heat pollution or as a civil right to not be too hot or too cold. Mm-hmm. I guess that would be somebody else's, but I want to think more about that and how that applies to each of you, right? This sense of that you go about change. Sometimes it means turning something over and over and over again until you see it differently to find a way forward. I think it would be very instructive for all of us to think about how we strategize for positive change. Sorry, that was pretty long-winded. I hope I left you something to chew on.
Well,
Jackie? Oh, Kelly.
I'll start it by pinging it off to the two of you. I mean, yeah, this is classic geographer thing. We say change the scale, change the question, change the phenomenon, right? If you're looking, if you're on the top of the hill looking at a city, you see it differently than if you're walking among the streets. But I was really fascinated by the complicated diagram that you showed of position, like the position you're in, and how the way you see yourself is so kind of intrinsically tied to everything that surrounds you. I have never really thought about that, but I feel like it takes this idea of flipping problems on their head one step further, and says it pings it to the individual. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you say that, Kelly, because it you know, it all starts with our developmental experiences, right? Like it all starts with our primary caregivers, our caretakers, that shape how we see ourselves and how we see the world. And so when you add that up and you put it in an environmental context and you have all of these ecological factors that influence sort of, the roles that we decide to play, the way we show up, all of that, to me, it's sort of it's one of the starting places for change. It's not always a starting place. Sometimes there are forcing functions. Sometimes things are happening that are well outside of our control that actually requires that we change, right? It like forces us to do things that we didn't know we could do or we didn't think was possible. So, I certainly can apply it to sort of racial equity and racial justice, but I just think about this for my own life. I think about it like, in terms of, because when I thought about this question, how do we change? I wasn't just thinking about like, how do we change society? I was thinking like, how do I actually change? Like, how does D'Artagnan become somebody different? How do I, somebody earlier in the chat said, well, what about me? Like, how do I do things for other people if I'm so like in a learning and growing space? And it took me years to figure out, what it takes for me to actually become the person that I want to become. How do I make my identity congruent with who I want to show up as? And I think that has helped me understand how to do this work, right? How do I want the world to be congruent as I see it? One where again we're able to be there for each other and support each other. So I think to me that's what that diagram represents. It's like I got to start with the thing I can control, which is me, and then try and help that shape and reshape the world around me. Which is, I think in some ways what I think you just said, you became passionate about heat, right? You're like, I want to address this issue. I think about my grandmother who was dealing with urban heat island effect. She didn't call it that. When we would go to the grocery store, she'd be like, baby, it's really hot. We need to stop and get under the shade over here because there are no trees. We would walk under the overpass of the church and we would like, every time we would need to move over just to get some heat. And then we'd stop in the park under the shade tree. We'd have to like stop on our way from the store carrying our groceries. Like, she didn't call it urban heat island effect. She just said it was too damn hot to be walking outside, right? So it's like that's, and then I remember that. And I remember what it was like walking down the street with my grandmother. We need to fix these issues. We need to increase canopy. We need to increase tree cut. Like that to me is where it starts. But
very much relate to everything you were just saying and how you started. We need to connect. I mean, it's gonna. I'm like, how did I have not connected with this young man? But because it does start from what spoke to me the most is how it starts within. It starts with me. It had to come from that place first and foremost. And I almost was gonna cut you in how that is continuous, right? I'm constantly evolving, constantly changing, even as an individual, because the whatever is happening on in the world is shifting that narrative constantly for me as an artist or as a facilitator or as an executive director, all these positions that I hold. And how do then I take time to reflect, think deeply about that work and how it not just affects me, but then the people around me. That's constant work. And there's honestly not that many resources if we really think about it, because these blueprints don't exist because being an innovative hip hop dance company is really new in so many ways. So it's a constant check-in. I mean, more than ever, it was the hardest during COVID, Vic. Even for me, like the breakdowns of like, am I doing this right? And am I being the best guy, teacher, instructor, facilitator, leader? Because that position of power made me really check in with myself in such deep ways too, that I didn't even think I had, but I did once I really started checking in with my community. So I'm speaking from the heart, as you can see, but it's all that I do. And that's where the work translates and it keeps me going. But that reaffirming and checking in with oneself is everything in order to provide for the rest and do it better and hopefully keep doing it better and better, right? So
I even reckon that for each of you, I see each of you as, as leaders and problem solvers, and that you are constantly doing that work of shifting what the problem is, looking at it from another angle, whether personally or in your research, as we call it in the university. I want to make a shift just because I know that there are going to be questions from our audience. Please use the Q&A or the chat and send us some of your questions. D'Artagnan, I saw that you went right to a very compelling question that was in the chat earlier about how do you work for change with others when you're still in the process of change. And I think, Jackie, you were just speaking to that, like who's not?
Exactly.
Yeah. But let's hear from other questions. Otherwise, we can keep talking to one another. How do we create change across difference? And I want to throw that, at all of you, like Kelly, like you are dealing with so many systems of the city, right? How does the change occur when we're trying to work on cities that will help us all to thrive? Or, how does that work for each of you? Across difference, how do we address change across difference?
Well, you have to embrace the difference I'm talking about biophysical difference. And I know that doesn't sound so sexy, but it is, I promise. That's where the really interesting stuff is, because something like cool paint, right? It works the same way no matter what asphalt you put it on. Like the mechanisms are the same, but when you put it on a roof, it's a different question than when you put it on a street, and it's a different question from when you put it on a playground. If you put it on a roof, there are no people, well, in theory, there are no people hanging out up there. So you don't have to worry about the people. If you put it on a street, you don't have to worry so much, but you have to think about the cars. But if you put it on a playground, you think, okay, now I'm a little bit more concerned about that heat, because we've got children, a vulnerable group to heat, running around exerting themselves during recess time, which happens to be in the middle of the day when the impacts of the adversarial kind of the heat impacts are the worst. So I think that the difference is what makes the questions interesting and compelling, and trickier maybe to solve from a policy perspective, which likes to do blanket things. And I would be remiss if I just didn't go back and say to our conversation before about us and people, there's this, I really am a geek for the sociology of science literature. And there's this term, the affective side of science, affect, AFF. And it's all about this stuff. Like it's the passion and it's the interrelationships between the teams that you're working with, which really undergird all innovation. So anyway.
I bet it's similar in the dance studio, right? And if you don't have trust and connection when you're working with your company, it's a very different result than.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Embracing it all, being more open than ever. And with openness comes vulnerability and time, patience to really listen and connect. Because all the work, at least that I've done with the company, has been in community always. But what does that mean too, to be working from that horizontal lens and really me being them and them being me in that moment? Shifting that paradigm, even in how the organization works. This doesn't work for me anymore. And that's all that was laid for me for many years. It's this is the narrative now. And then how together cohesively can we do it? And I can't help but when somebody just asked a question there, I think it was Casey, she's like, what is your advice for change makers when it comes to burnout and your individual capacity for makes the difference? I don't have the answer. I was going to tell you, you let me know when you find out, because I'm feeling like complete burnout. I don't know if it's because I'm in my early 40s and I've been doing this work so authentically and from the heart since I was 18, like just showing up. And now it's tiring. And that's what I meant by earlier, the resources, that sometimes I lack those resources because those models or blueprints don't exist. So I just thought I just get up front and letting Casey know I'm figuring it out as I go, but deep reflection and connecting with other leaders. I'm speaking, I'm hearing everyone speak and I'm already, how did I not know him? Because you got to engage with the folks that elevate you, so being around those folks helps as well. But I wouldn't have the answer. I'm figuring it out, but I'm experiencing the burnout. And I think COVID has something to do with that for sure.
I think, climate change, it's it's a big problem to solve, right? So racism in this country, inequity, I think these are huge. So burnout is a potential liability. And I'm wondering if Kelly and D'Artagnan, if you'd also just take a moment to think about fatigue and endurance for these larger change aspirations, that they're not just aspirations. This is where we're going. So how do you manage?
I will tell you, burnout is real. And about 2.5 years ago, this is before the pandemic, I was sitting in my office and finding myself just not having a lot of patience. I founded a nonprofit organization in LA that has grown over the past 14 years. So I was 14 years as an executive director. Jackie, Ms. Funk, I totally understand what you're saying. And I just found myself hitting walls. And what really helped me was actually getting a stress and resilience coach, just in practice, just as a practical matter. Like, I got a stress and resilience coach. And then I started examining, like, which relationships in my life did I feel like were contributing most to my stress. So I started like examining my stress, examining how I can alter that stress. And then I started camping. I got out of my office, took my family, took my kids, and I started blocking off time just to like rejuvenate, just to like break away, because I was so committed to the work that I felt guilty when I wasn't working, right? I feel guilty when I'm not doing something. I feel like I'm not contributing. It's all of that. And it has taken me, a couple of years to really force myself to pause. And I think you're right, like the pandemic made it even worse, because then I was at home and I felt even more guilty if I took like lunch. I have back-to-back Zoom meetings. Now I'm like eating my lunch with the camera off, trying to, unmute myself. And it just, it's taken me this, I've had to like force myself to find the thing that's the alternate to, that's sort of an alternate to working and responsibility and driving all that, and do the thing that my stress and resilience coach told me to do, which was, she asked me, she said, "What brings you joy?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" She said, "What brings you joy?" She said, "What brings you joy?" And I said, "Well, spending time with my family." She said, "Do more of that and do less of the thing that causes you stress." And that like one bit of advice was such an altering, it really helped to alter my life course, because I was like, oh, that's right. Do the thing that brings me more joy and do less of the other stuff. So that for me, that's been incredibly helpful.
Taking notes, just letting you know.
I think we all are. We all are.
There was a stress and resilience coach. I didn't even know that existed. Pass me her number.
Yes, I will.
We're going to get a lot of work tonight. But Kelly, I would love to hear, for you in your field, just, how fatigue and burnout works in terms of,
Well, a lot. I mean, literally and figuratively, I echo everything we just heard. Get a good therapist, establish healthy boundaries, take care of yourself first. I think of the airplane, you put your mask on you first. Otherwise, because my therapist basically said, you're always in fight or flight mode because you're giving too much of yourself to everything, right? And that was my watershed moment. I'm giving nothing if I'm not. But literally, I take teams out into the heat to drag equipment around out in the East Coachella Valley this summer. We had to shut down operations because it was too hot and people were starting to get signs of sickness. So literally fatigued, working with communities, recognizing that if I feel fatigued, that these communities that I'm working in that aren't privileged enough to have the job and the resources that I have, they're feeling fatigued, and to be really sensitive that maybe you have to think creatively about how you do work in the community. And one thing that I always try to do is think about what's the payoff for somebody. If I'm asking you to do something for me, what's the payoff for you? Yeah.
We're moving into, oh, you got to put up there, Dr. Scorza, in the chat. We're moving into the need to put some closure on this evening, but I just, want to point out that, I feel like we're talking about systemic change, we're talking about institutional change, and we're also talking about personal change, right? And they're not separate because here we are, we're part of these larger systems and institutions. And so many of the students here are both involved in larger projects of change, but are also working on self-care and burnout just to like continue on, working, studying, and so on. So I wonder if, just to give you each very short moment for some closing thoughts about what you'd like to offer to our students here, to think about change as they continue.
I'll be quick. So we saw the ladies, the tap dancers at one end of the generation, and I'm assuming that a lot of the students are kind of at the other end of the chain. Quite frankly, like I look to you guys. My daughter is a source of kind of thinking about change for me. My students. So you guys make me optimistic because you're not afraid of change in the way that adults become.
Thank you. That's a good reminder.
I feel like I'm going to sound repetitive because I'm saying it's all intertwined, but you show up authentically, you guys. I was afraid and not at the same time to show up as me, yet how do you just own that and show up and walk the walk? I can't help but see these Q&As. Somebody just said, how do you start a change if we're afraid others will not follow or support? So I'm going to end it with that. Just do it. If you're authentic, if you're real, people will follow. Many people sometimes approach that question first versus just putting the action. In hip hop, walk the walk, don't talk the talk, do it. And eventually you're going to fill in gaps where they're needed, and you start paying attention to those gaps and hopefully filling in the hole in that way. So if you show up very authentically, genuinely, with a lot of hard work and passion, the right folks will surround you. So I took that question and gave it a little bit of hope. Show up though, do it right.
Good work, Ms. Funk.
I will tell you the biggest thing that's helped me both facilitate change and also manage my desire to be a part of efforts that facilitate change is to find meaning. It's to really draw meaning from the work. It's less of a pursuit of like happiness. It's less of a pursuit of the outcome and more of a pursuit of what brings me the most meaning, and what's the most sort of meaningful thing that I can do, be it work, picking up my nephew and taking him for a swim, or, mentoring youth, or serving at UCLA in some capacity. It's like, what brings me meaning and helps me feel like every single day I did my absolute best with the few hours that I had to show up however, best I could in this world. So I think that meaningfulness and that meaning making and purpose driven, experience is what sort of, I think I encourage people to sort of, explore for yourself. Like, what would it take for you? It's a lot easier to show up to work when it doesn't feel like work, right? When it doesn't feel, it's like so much easier when it's like, yeah, this brings me meaning, this brings me joy. So that's what I would leave folk with is figure out what makes, brings you meaning.
I want to thank each of you for so much heart and for the work that you do out there in the community and in here in the institution, and for, in so many ways, bringing love and hope to the future. Thank you all for being here with us tonight to consider how we change, and this concludes this evening's program. We hope you'll join us again next week for How Do We Build? Next week, same time, new link. And to learn more about the entire series or to RSVP, visit arts.ucla.edu/10questions. Thank you and good night.